Silence can hold a confession, not the silence of shame, but the silence that precedes permission. Words that live in a man's throat, waiting for the moment when speaking them carries no cost, no danger, no rebuttal. A car accident on a frozen road. An end that came without ceremony, without warning, without the dignity of a battlefield. What followed was a careful quiet. Colleagues measuring their words. Subordinates watching for permission to grieve. And somewhere in that measured air, judgments formed that had never been voiced before. One general had known things about another, had watched him across years of war, had seen victories and losses, and the peculiar burden of genius married to impulse, had registered the cost of aggressiveness balanced against the cost of caution, and that knowledgeâ intimate, professional, dangerousâ remained locked behind rank and protocol while the man still lived. Only after the road accident, only after the funeral, only when speaking carried no consequence and silence became impossible, did those words finally surface, measured, deliberate, not in weakness, but in acknowledgement, as if the speaker had been waiting for permission he would never receive, and decided to speak anyway. This is the story of that admission, and what it reveals about two men who shaped the war in the Pacific, and could never quite reconcile what they saw in each other. General Douglas MacArthur had built himself into something beyond a general. His career spanned from the trenches of the First World War through the occupation of Japan. He had survived every challenge to his authority through a combination of competence and calculated defiance. By the time the Pacific War ended, he had become a force that American policy had to accommodate rather than command. The last word that belonged to MacArthur. General George Patton made his name through a different mathematics entirely. Where MacArthur cultivated distance and historical significance, Patton cultivated fury. He understood armor the way a musician understands his instrument. His divisions moved with speeds that broke German timetables and Soviet expectations. But restraint was not his gift. He thought aloud. He insulted newspapermen. He had slapped a soldier and never quite recovered from that single moment of uncontrolled rage, though he would spend the rest of his life attempting to redeem it. Two different wars kept these men apart. MacArthur commanded the Southwest Pacific. Patton was Eisenhower's weapon in Europe. Their operational paths never crossed. Yet each knew what the other was doing. Generals read reports. Generals watch rivals. Generals understand the implications of another man's success. What MacArthur knew of Patton came through dispatches and Army newspapers and careful assessments from officers who moved between theaters. What he saw was a general who won battles through sheer kinetic force. A man who understood that modern warfare demanded speed and aggression and a willingness to accept casualties because delay cost more lives than haste. Patton's Third Army drove across France and into Germany with momentum that cautious commanders could never achieve. But this aggression demanded payment. Patton's tanks ran ahead of supply lines. His infantry suffered casualty rates that made other commanders uncomfortable. The speed that saved lives by shortening campaigns also claimed lives by not allowing time for preparation. Patton understood this equation and accepted it as the price of victory. MacArthur, from his position in the Pacific, was winning through different means. Strategy emphasizing precision. Bypass, encircle, contain. Use naval and air superiority to strangle enemy positions rather than assault them directly. His casualty ratios were lower than Patton's. His campaigns took longer, but they demonstrated that speed and aggression were not the only path to victory, and perhaps not always the wisest path. Two different philosophies of warfare. Professional soldiers could disagree about which was superior. Serious military minds could marshal evidence for both approaches. But MacArthur's assessment carried something else within EDA, a recognition of power combined with a judgment about control. Here was a general who could not be trusted completely because he could not trust himself. Here was brilliance that had to be watched because brilliance without restraint becomes dangerous. MacArthur had built his entire career on the premise that a supreme commander required supreme independence. He had resisted superiors, manipulated politicians, and maneuvered himself into positions where he could not be overruled without creating political chaos. Making himself indispensable became his strategia, a combination of competence and calculated defiance. He understood how much authority rested on controlling one's own narrative and one's own impulses. Patton, by contrast, was a creature of impulse who had learned to harness it rather than contain it. His slapping incident had nearly destroyed his career. He had written extensively about his philosophy of warfare and believed in aggressive pursuit of victory with religious intensity, but subordination defined him. He answered to Eisenhower. He worked within constraints. His brilliance remained on terms he did not entirely dictate. MacArthur never criticized Patton publicly while Patton lived. Professional courtesy maintained itself between them. Strategy disagreements remained private. Public unity took precedence over private assessment, not because they were friends, but because they understood the rules that govern how great men could speak about each other. Protocol mattered. The Pacific War consumed MacArthur's attention during Patton's greatest campaigns. The European theater was Eisenhower's domain. Island hopping occupied MacArthur naval battles, the slow accumulation of advantage against an enemy with nowhere to retreat. By the time Patton raced across Germany, MacArthur was preparing for the final assault on Japan, an operation expected to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and would never happen because of the atomic bomb and Japan's surrender in August of 1945. Patton did not survive the war by long. In December of 1945, 5 months after Germany's surrender, he was in Germany with occupation forces. A staff car carrying him struck a truck on an icy road near Mannheim. Sudden, terrible, final. Patton was hospitalized with injuries that paralyzed him from the neck down. 2 weeks of visitors and care and quiet conversation. Then, on December 21st, 1945, death came. The American public mourned. Patton had become legend. Newspapers celebrated his aggressiveness, his victories, his larger-than-life personality. Soldiers who had served under him spoke of his genius. Even in death, mythology ascended. The general who had driven the Nazis across Europe, who had moved faster than supply lines could follow, who had understood war as an extension of WWII, that general was gone. Somewhere in the aftermath, MacArthur spoke. Not publicly, not in formal statement, not in the carefully constructed autobiography he would later publish. Instead, words emerged in private conversations, to confidants, to officers who knew both men and understood what was being said. Measured words, neither warm nor cold, neither vindication nor cold, neither vindication nor condemnation. What surfaced from those private conversations was a recognition that Patton had been essential and problematic in equal measure. His aggressiveness had saved lives by shortening campaigns, but his aggressiveness had also cost lives by refusing the patience that sometimes allowed solutions requiring less blood. He had been a military genius, in a particular sense, understanding how to move armies and concentrate force and break through enemy defenses. But this genius came with a fundamental inability to see beyond the immediate tactical problem to the larger implications of how victory was achieved. MacArthur's assessment was that Patton had been the instrument for a particular kind of war, precisely calibrated for particular theaters and particular moments. But that same calibration that made him invaluable also made him, in MacArthur's judgment, fundamentally limited in scope. Winning battles was not the same as winning wars. Aggression without strategic vision created victories that sometimes cost more than patience would have demanded. These were not new thoughts. MacArthur had held these assessments for years, probably since the early days of Patton's European campaigns. But saying them while Patton lived would have been a violation of protocol and professional courtesy. Patton could have responded. Patton could have defended his tactics. Patton could have argued Euro, and Patton was formidable in argument. The conversation would have become public. Consequences would have rippled through the military hierarchy. But Patton was gone now, dead, unable to respond, unable to defend himself, unable to argue back. The ground had shifted. What followed was neither praise nor condemnation. MacArthur spoke of Patton as a man who had understood the nature of aggressive warfare and had wielded that understanding with genius. But he also made clear in private, to those who would listen that this understanding had limits, that Patton's philosophy of warfare assumed conditions that did not always exist, that sometimes the enemy could be defeated without the casualties that Patton's approach demanded. that there were multiple paths to victory, and the path that emphasized aggression was not always the wisest or the most humane. Officers who heard these words understood what was being said. MacArthur was establishing a historical record. He was making clear that while he respected Patton's accomplishments, he did not agree with Patton's fundamental approach to warfare, that he had observed Patton's methods and found them, on reflection, to be problematic in ways he could now safely articulate. The timing mattered. Patton was dead. The war was over. Eisenhower was not present to defend his subordinate. There would be no military controversy, no public dispute. MacArthur could speak with the authority of retrospect and the safety of silence from those who might have contradicted him. But MacArthur's words, once spoken, began to circulate. Officers repeated them. Historians would eventually hear them. What had been private admission became part of the historical recordiero, a judgment rendered by one of history's great military figures on another, a judgment that could never be answered or debated because the man being judged was dead. Some historians would later argue that MacArthur's assessment was unfair. Patton had been asked to achieve rapid results in a particular context, and he had achieved them. His casualty ratios, while higher than MacArthur's, were not unreasonable given the nature of mobile warfare in Europe. Patton had won when others might have been cautious, and speed had indeed saved lives in certain contexts. MacArthur's philosophy of bypassing and containing enemy positions had worked in the Pacific, but it had been applied against an enemy that had fewer options for retreat and counterattack than the Germans possessed. But fairness was not the point. MacArthur had established his position. Patton could not answer, and in the years that followed, Patton's reputation would be complicated by this historical judgment. He would be remembered as brilliant and aggressive and ultimately limited in his understanding of what warfare demanded. He would be the general who won battles, but perhaps not the general who could have orchestrated a more complete vision of victory. What drove MacArthur to speak? Perhaps it was professional conscience. Perhaps it was the opportunity to establish his own approach to warfare as superior. Perhaps it was simply that speaking becomes easier when the subject cannot hear. The motivations of great men are rarely simple, and MacArthur was a man of considerable complexity. He had spent his entire career managing his image and his legacy. Patton's death created an opportunity to shape how his own approach would be remembered in contrast to Patton's. In the years after the war, as histories began to be written and memoirs began to be published, Patton's reputation ascended into near mythological status. The movie industry was fascinated by him. Hollywood would eventually create a version of Patton that captured his aggression and his confidence, but simplified his complexity. He became, in popular culture, the embodiment of American military aggression and can-do spirit. But officers who had heard MacArthur's private words knew something different. They knew that the two great commanders of Pacific and European theaters had disagreed fundamentally about how warfare should be waged. They knew that MacArthur, looking back, had judged Patton's approach as correct for its time and place, but ultimately limited in its vision. They knew that the man who had won more battles had perhaps not understood war in a way that the man who had won fewer but larger campaigns understood it. The car accident that killed Patton had also, in a sense, killed a conversation that might have happened had Patton lived longer, had he been available to defend his record, had he been able to argue his case. Instead, what happened was a kind of historical closure. MacArthur spoke. Patton could not answer, and that became the final word. Historians have puzzled over MacArthur's assessment for decades. Was he being fair? Was he influenced by professional rivalry? Was he correct that Patton's aggressive approach, while brilliant, was fundamentally limited? The questions remain unanswered because neither man was available to settle them. Patton was dead. MacArthur, when pressed on these matters in later interviews, remained measured and refused to elaborate publicly beyond what he had already said in private. What we are left with is a historical judgment rendered by one great commander on another, a judgment that could only be safely rendered after death had made response impossible. What we are left with is a knowledge that MacArthur's respect for Patton's accomplishments was real, but his reservations about Patton's philosophy were equally real. What we are left with is the implication that genius in warfare is not monolithic, that different approaches can succeed, and that the approach that wins battles most quickly is not necessarily the approach that wins wars most wisely. The admission MacArthur made was not melodramatic. It was not a confession of jealousy or rivalry. It was, rather, a careful articulation of a professional difference that had existed all along, but could only be spoken once the other party was beyond hearing. It was a truth rendered finally and carefully in the language of restraint and military professional judgment. And it changed nothing, and it changed everything. Patton remained a legendary general of aggressive warfare. MacArthur's reservations did not prevent Patton from being remembered as a genius in his field. But those who knew the history knew that MacArthur's final assessment existed as well. They knew that somewhere in the historical record, one of America's greatest generals had looked back and said, in effect, he was brilliant, yes, but he did not understand everything that needed to be understood. The road was icy. The truck came without warning. Patton's car was struck, and he was paralyzed, and 2 weeks later he was gone. And in his absence, someone who had watched him for years finally spoke. What he said was measured and careful and restrained. What he said revealed a disagreement that went deeper than military tactics. What he said established for history a judgment that Patton could never hear and never answer. That was the admission. That was what MacArthur said after Patton was killed. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in the careful, professional language of a man who understood that some things could only be said when response was impossible, when silence would have been a kind of dishonesty, and speaking was at last safe.